Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce everyone to Dr. Christopher Tuttle, very esteemed archaeologist and specialist, particularly on Hellenistic and Roman periods of the Middle East and Africa. This is the second part of Christopher's lecture. Tonight he's going to be talking to us about Corsica, the most beautiful one, which I think is a most intriguing title. So would you please welcome Dr. Christopher Tuttle, who's getting up at some dreadful hour in the middle of the night in order to give us this lecture. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you, Susanna. Very appreciate the introduction. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining for this second part talk on Sardinia and Corsica. Corsica being called the most beautiful one, and we will come to that later in the talk as to the origin of that epithet. So just to start off, I'm going to open here with an image of where Sardinia and Corsica are located to the west of the Italian boot. So today we'll be talking about the northern of the two islands, and that is Corsica right there. On Tuesday, we spoke about Sardinia, the southern island. So everyone who's traveled with me or heard me speak before knows I'm very much into geography, geology, topography, because I find that they are very essential to understanding many times how cultures and peoples evolve in the landscape that they have to utilize. So just very quickly, Corsica is the fourth largest island in the Mediterranean. It's often called the mountain in the sea because it really is essentially one giant mountain with a whole lot of peaks. It's caused from uplift from the movement of tectonic plates, with the African plate moving into the Eurasian plate, the same process that forms the Alps. It began about 60 million years ago and is continuing to grow to this very day. The island is essentially divided into two distinct geological formations, and that's the image on the right-hand side of your screen, where the pink is all this crystalline granitic rocks that actually were formed when the supercontinents existed way back hundreds of millions of years ago. And that's a piece of one of the supercontinents that's attached to the African plate that is what's ramming north into the Eurasian plate. The yellow deposits off onto the right side of the thing are sedimentary deposits that have formed over, again, millions of years. The thing to really pay attention to is the central mountain spine, and you can see that here on the right here. And it's got more than 50 peaks that are over 2,000 meters high. So some of the highest mountains in the entire Mediterranean region are all clustered here in Corsica. As a result of all this geology, it's very diverse, it has very rich soils, has great agriculture in the valleys, and also spectacular viticulture or winemaking, wine growing and winemaking along the lower slopes of many of these mountains. So one of the things to really enjoy when you go to Corsica is some really spectacular French wine. So I'm going to jump right into prehistory because we got a lot of ground to cover tonight about this island. So we're going to start off with just a quick overview here, and I'm not going to read through it all. I've written it out on the screen for you. The earliest solid habitations that we're going to talk about begin really in the Neolithic period. So that's about 6,000 BC. And the three major sites are indicated here on the map, and the smaller inset here shows where they are in relation to the whole size of the island. So the human history goes back, we now know, to the Upper Paleolithic, but that's only attested at one point, one site still in the research. And it's way up here on the very tip of the northern peninsula. And it's called the Coscia Grotto, or Cave of Costia. And you can't visit it because it's a research site, but it has anthropogenic, that is, deposits created by humans that date back before 9,000 BC. Probably, we're not exactly sure because we don't have a lot of good datable material yet, but it is at the end of the last major glaciation. So when the glaciers from the Ice Age receded and the coastlines rose out of the water, this was definitely a place where early humans went and were hunting on this island. Now, the actual oldest skeleton that we have is only from about 6,500 BC, and we only have one from this far back. And it was found in this rock shelter that's just outside of Bonifacio on the southern tip of the island. And it's fascinating because it is a woman, she's 30 to 35 years old, which at 6,500 BCE, that is epically old. Difficult life attested by analysis of her bones. We know that she had multiple bone fractures. It appears her left arm was paralyzed from birth. She had a deformed left foot, and she probably died from an oral infection because of the broken molar in her jaw. But that is just fascinating because to live that long at that time with such physical conditions, she was likely assisted her entire life by her community, which tells us a lot about how the people at that time took care of each other. When they buried her in this cave, she was laid flat on her back, and at some point they came back to the skeleton and coated it with red ochre. This is very typical of these Mesolithic period burials all throughout the Western European continent. So we have one of these on the island of Corsica as well. The next period we want to talk about is the megalithic period, which spans the Neolithic and Bronze Ages in this part of the world. And we have dolmens, the most famous one being here, the Fontanaccia one at Caura. And we also have menhirs, which are very distinct in Corsica. It's one of the things that their prehistory is really known for. Here's an example at the site of Filitosa on the right-hand side of your screen. And at the site of Filitosa, we've got one of the biggest collections of these menhirs. So here's just an image on the left to show some of the menhirs in situ on the walls. This is one that's out in the middle of a field on the right-hand side of the screen here. It has a face. We don't know at this time period what theology was like, what social belief systems were in these early prehistoric cultures, because they're prehistoric. We have no writings. We have nothing in their own words to tell us what these things meant. So variously, menhirs have been interpreted as giant phallic symbols that were meant to symbolize the fertility, the impregnation of the earth, if you will. In other cases, especially these here in Corsica, where quite a few of them have either swords, like you can see the hilt of this one figure here, plus faces. They have armor sometimes depicted on them. So it's also posited that they may represent protective spirits, ancestral spirits, for example, they would put up around their communities and to protect them. Not unlike the Nuragic civilization that we talked about a couple of days ago, these communities were insular in that, as far as we can tell, the structure of this culture, the Torrean culture, was decentralized. It was a hierarchical society. It seems to have been like there would have been chiefs and maybe councils of elders and stuff overseeing how things work. And maybe those figures of the menhirs are representative of the ancestors who served those roles in the past. But the Torrean culture, we did not see menhirs in the Nuragic culture. We do have them in the Torrean culture. Now, these people appear to be indigenous to the island. They start to have an identifiable culture as at the late 3rd millennium BC. So here we're talking somewhere between 2,500 down to 2000 BCE. And for those who remember from my talk the other night, that's 300 to 500 years earlier than the Nuragic culture. It becomes identifiable. We don't know the name of the people. Again, we don't have any written records, so we don't know what they call themselves. We call them Torrean, and that comes from the word Tori, which is a word for tower. And their early material culture is also characterized by this series of small towers that are either built soon before or contemporary with the nuraghes that we saw in Sardinia the other day. The simpler ones, the towers with the flat tops on where we think they built in the case of the Nuragic. But in the case of the Torreans in Corsica, they built around them, apparently not so much on top of them. They remain in use and identifiable as Torrean up until the mid first century BC. That's around 500 BC, because it's right around that time period when the Ligurian tribes start to colonize from the mainland Italy and Greek colonists arrive on the island. At that point, the Torrean culture begins to disappear. The characteristic of this culture, as I mentioned, are the towers, and the towers being incorporated into castles, so the Torri and the Castelli. One of the most famous sites that we'll visit on the tour is Cucuruzzu. And you can see here, oh, there we have Kristen again, and former ASA leader, Anketi. But just to give you a sense of scale at how tall these structures are, and here's one of the entranceway gates of it. So I just want to give you a sense of some of these monuments. Another form of the Castelli is this one at Castello Araju, and it's built with dry masonry. There's no mortar involved. The stones are all dry laid. In some cases, they have been shaped to fit, but by and large, it is just gather the material, build the structures. The next period of note is the Iron Age, and so I'm going to quickly go through the Iron Age to late antiquity for Corsica. Iron Age is when the Ligurians and the Greeks come to the island. And the Greeks, interestingly enough, came from way over here on the west coast of modern Turkey, and from this city called Phocaea, which these people originally had emigrated and colonized Western Anatolia from over here on the Ionian Islands in the Ionian Sea. So it's fascinating to me that the Greek colonists went east, established themselves on the west coast of Turkey, and then eventually came back around way over here and colonized Corsica, but didn't colonize Sardinia. So it's from these Ionian Greeks that it's with these settlers that Corsica enters our historical records. And they called the island officially Kernos. We don't exactly know what that means. It could be a reference to the Cape, although they settled here at Alaria. They called it Alalia, and the Romans later changed it to Alaria. The whole island they called Kernos, and another possible etymology there is forested, because it is a heavily forested island. But it very quickly takes on a nickname, and that is Caliste, where I get the phrase, the most beautiful one, comes from. And that is how the island was colloquially known in various forms after the Greeks colonized. The Iron Age then continues with the Greeks actually controlled most of the coastal regions of the island until 278 BCE, when the Carthaginians finally kicked the Greek colonists out and take control of Corsica. There was a famous battle as early as 540, so 20-something years after their first colony was established, they're already in conflict with an alliance of the Carthaginians from North Africa and the Etruscans from mainland Italy. Even though the Greeks were defeated by the Carthaginian Etruscan alliance, the Carthaginians didn't actually take over the island for another almost 250 years. And they only controlled the island for a couple of decades, basically, less than a couple of decades, before the Romans, as part of the Punic Wars, the Romans drive the Carthaginians out and take over the coastal parts of the island. They refound Alalia as Illyria, and it takes them quite a long time, and almost a century, to finally subdue the interior of the island. And as we go forward and see some of the imagery from the island, you're going to see why. The landscape was just incredibly rugged. And so it was very, very difficult. People could really dig into those fortresses that they had built in the earlier periods and just hold off even the Roman legions. Then the Romans basically stay in control until 456 CE. And the famous Battle of Corsica is when the Germanic Vandals seize Corsica from the Western Roman Empire. Now, those of you who recall your history will know that it was 455 when the Vandals sacked Rome. And a year later, they've pushed out further into the Western Empire, and they now take control of Corsica. And I just wanted to pop in a couple of side notes here, because I see this in a lot of sources about, oh, well, first off, the vandalism. That word, of course, comes into English from, we're always told, from the sacking of Rome. But when you delve into the actual sources for the etymology of the word, you discover that the Battle of Corsica was also a factor in why the whole concept of the Vandals being destructive and violent and brutal comes from the sacking of Rome as well as the Battle of Corsica. But the second thing I always find fascinating is you'll see a lot of sources mention that Corsairs, the word, comes from Corsica. And in fact, that's not true. Corsair is from the medieval Latin cursorius, meaning a course. And it comes into play as a word, a synonym for pirate, only in the 18th century. And it's actually from the French lettre de corps, meaning a letter of marque. And this is the distinction here being that privateers were conducting piracy on behalf of a state versus pirates, or true corsairs, in the way the word has come to mean in English language, were just out for the loot, and they weren't doing it on behalf of a state. So that's just a fascinating little side note I discovered in the research. The European privateers and corsairs have been in place in the 16th century, and we're all probably very familiar with Sir Francis Drake being a famous privateer for Queen Elizabeth I of England. Okay, so I hate to have text slides, but I had no choice here because I just needed to cover all this stuff for you. So 469 CE, the Vandals finally subjugate the interior of Corsica. And this is key because it's a very forested island, and they were running their pirate fleets, their corsair fleets, as we call them in later centuries. And they needed the wood. So they really worked over the course of a decade, almost 2 decades, to subjugate the interior. And they managed to hold the island until the Byzantines take control of it in 534. But their control is always a bit liminal. They're constantly engaged with the Ostrogoths, the Lombards, and eventually the Umayyad Caliphate forces coming out of North Africa. Finally, the Lombards, who have taken over mainland Italy by the 700s, they come and they take the island of Corsica away from the Byzantine Empire. They only hold it for about 50 years, and then Charlemagne conquers it and takes it and gives it to the Holy Roman Empire. And back and forth for the next 200 years, different people invade. It's very messy. So I've just summed it in there with about a 35-year period where ownership of the island flipped back and forth between the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Italy. And eventually it does kind of stay with the Roman Empire until 1077. And at this point, the people on the island of Corsica are just done. They've been constantly conquered and just subjugated ever since the Greeks arrived in 560 something BC. So in 1077, they appealed to Pope Gregory VII to just please give us some peace. And this is actually, for those of you who have traveled with me and heard me talk about that year 1000 and the century that follows, that ultimately would lead to the European Crusades against the Holy Land. But there was a whole movement during that century called the Peace of God. And the Corsicans took advantage of that. And the Pope did intercede. But rather than make them a kingdom in their own right, he basically said, okay, I'm going to give you control to the Pisa the Pisa bishopric. Well, that didn't really create the peace because their great enemy, Genoa, then decided that they wanted a piece of Corsica, and so fighting continues. 1217, Corsica is finally annexed as one of the papal states, but administration still remains with Pisa. And it's not until 1284 that Genoa finally defeats Pisa and takes control of Corsica, and they manage to continue to hold the island for the most part over the next 500 years until the independent state of the Corsican Republic is formed in 1755. Okay, so what do we see from all of that history? That was a lot of history. So we're going to turn now to taking a look at the legacy of some of those events. Now, the early period between the prehistory and the medieval period, where the Byzantines were there, the Vandals were there, we have almost nothing on the ground left to show from those time periods. So really the next oldest material we have that we'll see on the tour is from the medieval period. And here is one of the oldest cities on the island, and it is Sartène. And it is an example here of one of those medieval cities built on a hilltop, very clustered, very windy, curvy streets. And many of the buildings still exist. And I've included this lovely image here of a modern shop in one of the original buildings that was a shop of the same type. So I find that fascinating. And it's a charcuterie store. Another example where we can see medieval architecture is in Bonifacio, which is the place where we will arrive when we depart Sardinia. We arrive at the foot of these gorgeous white limestone cliffs. And this city, much of the city is still from the original build in the medieval period. And one of the most striking monuments is the Church of Saint-Marie de Majeur that you can see the tower of here in one of the narrow streets. The next major period of material that we'll see in the stunning landscapes are the Genoese towers from that 500-year period when they were controlling the island. And I've included a couple of the ones that can be seen when traveling on this tour, and that's the Parada Tower here in Ajaccio, which was built in 1550 or 1551. And we have a second one that I've included of 3 or 4 that we'll see on the tour. I've decided to include this one from Sartène of the Tower of Senatosa, which is 60 years after the one I just showed you. So this one was built in 1610. But we also have a couple of churches, and one of the most exquisite ones that we can visit on this tour is the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Assumption of Ajaccio, built in 1593 in very typical mid-Renaissance architectural style. And it's been modified many times. It's got a lot of chapels on the interior. This central photograph is of the central apse. I didn't include photographs of the different chapels, but I did want to point out that it has some great 19th century art. Some of my favorites are the Delacroix. There are marvelous frescoes and a whole series of studies that he did for the frescoes can be seen when you visit this church. But there's also here some phenomenal paintings from Tintoretto and a number of lesser known artists that can also be seen in this particular church. Then we get to the Age of Enlightenment, and it's when Corsica finally gets its short-lived independence. In 1755, they said enough with the Genoese. The Genoese are still on the island, but they're largely holed up in a few of those towers and a few forts in some of the cities in the high parts of the country, and not so much along the coast. And the Corsicans rise up and they declare that they are going to be independent. And it's a fascinating bit of history because it's the first modern constitution based on Enlightenment principles that was actually written. I know a lot of that credit is often given to the United States with its constitution drafted after 1776. But this Corsican one predates it by a couple of decades. It was actually drafted in 1755, 1756. And it was the first constitution written in the Italian language. And fascinating, it gave the right of the vote to women and men. It articulated a very functional legislature structure, a very streamlined administrative structure, not Byzantine at all. It established a independent judiciary system, and it declared the founding of an army, which never actually happened because in 1764, less than a decade later, the Genoese, who, like I said, are still there on the island. So the Corsican Republic is trying to get off the ground, but behind closed doors, the Genoese make a secret treaty with the French and sell them the island. And 6 years later, France officially annexes Corsica, and that is the history of the end of the Corsican Republic, if you will. Paoli does attempt several times to reassert the independence, but it never really takes off. And it stays a dependence of the French government until it still is, but as of 2001, they have a degree of limited autonomy that was part of that denationalization or movement that when France gave up a lot of its former colonies and helped them achieve independence. One of the last ones this movement affected was Corsica. So it's not totally free like Algeria is, but it does have more autonomy than a lot of other of France's holdings. So that is essentially my quick rundown of the history of Corsica. And I don't want to keep you all so long tonight, so I'm going to transition away now from the history and really just take a few minutes to show you some of the extraordinary landscape on which this tapestry of historical events unfolded. So one of the most stunning places that is right at the beginning of our tour is the Lavezzi archipelago, which is a series of small islands between Sardinia and Corsica. And it's just this stunning landscape dotted out of the sea. And you can see where, as we go forward looking at these images, you're going to see why the Greeks called it Calliste, the beautiful one, and why the French continue to this day to call it the Isle of Beauty. And every time period since the Greeks first started writing about this island, whether you're talking about the Romans or the Byzantine or the medieval cultures, the Renaissance cultures, all of them flag this beauty as the primary characteristic of the island. And if you have never been, it truly is a breathtaking place to visit. So one of the other astounding places is the Col de Bavella. And it's this incredible mountainous forested region. And just a couple of images here to give you a sense. And remember, these mountains are over 2,000 meters in height. So it's quite a trek from the coast to the top of the mountains, but some of the most stunning landscapes and seascapes available anywhere in the Mediterranean. Here's another one. These are three examples of what you can see just traveling along the highway to Piana, which is one of the things we'll do toward the end of our visit to the island of Corsica. And another famous trek is through Calacuccia, and it's the Scala di Sta Regina, and pardon my terrible pronunciation of the Italian, but again, just breathtaking views around every corner. And it's also one of the places where we can see some more of the Genoese architecture. I've included here an image of one of the best preserved of the multiple arched Genoese bridges built in the late medieval period. And then just a beautiful image of a mountains and streams off there to the right. And lastly, I want to throw in a pitch for the Scandola Nature Reserve, a breathtaking area of preserved wilderness where it became a World Heritage Site, one of those natural World Heritage reserves. Honestly, I forget right now. I'm very tired. I can't remember the year, but I think somewhere in the 1990s, it was granted World Heritage Natural Preserve status. And it does contain some of the most unique wildlife of any of the islands in the Mediterranean. There are some of the critters that live in this reserve we don't find outside of North Africa. We don't find them on Sardinia. We don't find them on mainland Italy. But for some reason, they have managed to survive here in the Scandala Nature Reserve. So it's really one of the high points, I believe, of this tour. And with that, I'm actually going to bring this to an end. I know it's shorter than usual, but I'm hoping that we'll have some questions. So thank you all for your attention, and I'm open to any feedback and questions you might have.
Huge thank you, Christopher. That was really fascinating, learning so much more about Corsica, its history, its landscapes. It was really wonderful. So does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask?
Chris here. I did ask you a question late yesterday about back around the Neolithic time, the comparison between peoples on the two islands. You're saying that they were completely different, or there appeared to be no relationship between them, or don't we know?
Okay, so in the sense of their cultural identity and development of the material culture, they're actually very distinct. And the word, interestingly enough, that we use in the academic world for it is insular, because they're island cultures. That doesn't mean that they didn't interact, because we know for a fact that they did. In some of these Torrean sites, Sardinian obsidian has been found, is one example. So yeah, there's interactions going on, but they're not developing, like the pottery that the Torrean civilization develops is clearly distinct from the Nuragic. And it doesn't seem that either of them were trading between the two islands. And so pottery wasn't a trade good. We do find Nuragic pottery, showed an image the other night on mainland Italy, but nothing significant has been recovered from the sites in Corsica. So I'm not sure if I answered that clearly, Russell, but they developed distinctly separate cultures with certain similarities that you find regardless of the geographical location. So you'll find megalithic similarities in Brittany and Normandy, in the megalithic cultures there, that are shared with the megalithic sites on both Sardinia and Corsica. So there is clearly some sort of transference of knowledge or imagery or technique that is happening. But in the case of these two islands, the Nuragic culture and the Torrean culture, very distinct. It has actually been posited by some scholars that the whole concept of building the Nuragi, those towers, may have actually come from the Torreans and those Tori, because they do predate the Nuragi, we think, in some cases. Although some of them also do seem to be contemporary with the Proto-Nuragi on Sardinia. So is that a shared material cultural phenomenon? Or did they evolve it distinctly separate? We really can't answer that.
Maybe they were trying to create a differentiation between we're different to you, we're not the same.
Well, I'll give you an example for each. Both cultures during the Bronze Age, which is when both of them were at their heyday, both developed bronze working. And we saw some examples of those beautiful, sophisticated Nuragic bronze statuettes. The Torreans didn't have that. They used their metalworking to make practical stuff and jewelry. We don't have the figural stuff. Now, it's not to say they didn't do it. Maybe it was there and it hasn't survived. But to date, we don't have anything to suggest that it was a major part. The Nuragic, on the other hand, didn't do the menhirs. They did the megalithic dolmens before they started building the Nuragi. We have the dolmens on Corsica. Again, that's shared. We find that all the way to Ireland, right? Through Western Europe. But the Torreans on Corsica had this purpose for the menhirs. Nuragic culture on Sardinia didn't. So two distinctions there that are very clear.
From Helen, could you tell us something about the interior, please?
The interior. Okay, well, some of those images that I showed of the very mountainous sites, that's what the interior is like. It is very forested. It is very precipitous between the tops of the mountains and the valleys. So they're very sharp, very steep slopes in some cases. The ecology is very different from what you'll have down on the coastline because of that 2,000-meter variance in height. So the types of trees that grow on the tops of the mountains and the plants and the wildflowers and stuff are quite different from what you'll find down on the coast. It appears that from the prehistoric time, the people tended to build their secure, defensible sites further up the mountains. They were still utilizing the coastline. They were fishing. They had sailing ability, but they utilized the landscape for defensive purposes. And because of the wood resources, the nuts, the other forest-based food stuffs were a major source from up on those higher elevations. So I hope that answers your question.
Monica says, it looks like you could row or sail across to Sardinia. Why is there not more interaction? And Helen also asks, why was there little contact between these islands?
Okay, so I'm going to bring up the phrase that I used the other night as well. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So you're 100% right. The distance between the two islands is relatively small, and it's made even smaller by the archipelago of the smaller islands, like in the Lavezzi archipelago. So you could island hop until the final push from the last of the archipelago islands until you hit the Sardinian coast. And they were definitely going back and forth. What we cannot say is what they were doing beyond trade, because we see very little material culture impact from either side on either island. So it's very possible that they were intermarrying, that there were shared cultural events that we simply just don't have evidence for and no record of. So again, I would say that there was a significant amount of interaction between the two islands. We just can't see it in the evidence that we have to date. I want to put a pin in here. I showed maps on the Nuragic civilization the other night where a lot of archaeological work has been done on Sardinia. I mean, all of those surveys showing the thousands of sites that were demonstrated on the maps. That level of work has still never really been undertaken on Corsica. The French do amazing work, but the landscape itself is very rugged. So it can take years to survey just one or two valleys in between the mountains because it's very, very rugged and it's forested. So you're looking for traces of civilizations after millennia of tree growth and undergrowth and whatnot has come up. So it's, again, not to say that there wasn't more going on Corsica. We just don't have the level of documentation to show it.
And I have one more. It's from Judy. She says, I have a memory of Corsica, the smells. We stopped for a photo op and were overwhelmed by the rosemary going wild. Also a little yellow flower, I think margerelle, which is available as a perfume by L'Occitane.
But I'm not surprised. L'Occitane has a wide variety of scents that are indigenous to France. I mean, I know that one of the major sources for their perfumery is the lavender fields in the south of France, in Provence. So I would not be at all surprised. Corsica in particular has a lot of untouched landscape where people are still gathering resources in very traditional ways. Nobody's come in, or very few instances where people have come in and built factories to extract a particular scent from a particular flower. And a lot of that stuff is still done in Corsica on a very cottage industry level. And a bunch of people do it in a particular region. So in the end, the output is significant enough to be able to supply major companies like L'Occitane, but you don't see the industrial production like you would say for the lavender in Provence.
Thank you, Christopher. And it's been a fascinating lecture from the smells, the landscapes, the history, the peoples of Corsica. Certainly a really fascinating part of the world that I would very, very much like to visit. So, Christopher, thank you so much for sharing with us your knowledge and also your passion for this part of the world. It's been a really fascinating lecture. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Bye, everyone.